They said the Duke of Ravenshire would never love again. Not after that night when the estate echoed with screams of childbirth, and the silence that followed broke him into pieces no title could mend. 2 infant daughters survived, but their mother did not. And Joseph buried more than his wife that cold January morning. He buried his capacity to feel. What no one expected was that a penniless widow with empty arms and a shattered heart would walk through his gates months later, hired only to nurse his children. What happened between them in the shadows of that grieving house would scandalize an entire county and force them both to choose between propriety and a love neither believed they deserved. The stone corridors of Ravenshire carried sound like a cruel instrument, amplifying every echo until it became unbearable. Joseph Carrington, Duke of Ravenshire, stood frozen outside the birthing chamber, his hands pressed flat against the cold wall as if he could somehow push through it and change what was happening inside. The screams had stopped. That should have brought relief, but the silence that followed was far worse. It stretched and thickened until he could barely breathe through it. When the door finally opened, the midwife's face told him everything before her mouth could form the words. "Your Grace, I am so terribly sorry." Joseph did not remember walking into the room. He did not remember the midwife stepping aside or the way the other women lowered their eyes as he passed. All he saw was Eleanor, impossibly still against the white sheets, her dark hair fanned across the pillow like she was merely sleeping, but the pallor of her skin, the absolute absence of movement in her chest, shattered that illusion immediately. 2 infants wailed from a basket near the fire. Premature, fragile, their cries thin and desperate. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, held one while a wet nurse tried to soothe the other, but neither woman looked at him. They knew, everyone knew, these children had cost him everything. Joseph approached the bed slowly, each step heavier than the last. He reached out and touched Eleanor's hand, still warm. For a moment his mind played a vicious trick, suggesting she might yet wake, might yet smile at him the way she had on their wedding day 7 years ago. But her fingers did not curl around his. Her eyes did not open. He had loved her. Not with the desperate passion of poets, perhaps, but with the steady devotion of a man who honored his vows. She had been kind, graceful, everything a duchess should be. And now she was gone, leaving him with 2 tiny lives he had no idea how to protect. "My lord," the wet nurse whispered behind him, "one of them will not take the breast." Joseph turned. The woman looked exhausted, her dress stained, her face creased with worry. The infant in her arms was red-faced and screaming, tiny fists flailing. "They need names, sir," Mrs. Whitfield said quietly. "For the baptism, names." He had not thought that far. He and Eleanor had discussed it, of course, laughing over tea about what they might call a son, perhaps a daughter. But twins? And without Eleanor here to help decide? "Not yet," he said, his voice rough and unfamiliar even to himself. "There will be time." But there was no time. There was only duty now, duty and the crushing weight of a title that demanded he remain composed, even as his world collapsed. The days that followed blurred together into a waking nightmare. Joseph signed papers he barely read, received physicians who murmured condolences he did not hear, and walked the estate grounds until his boots were caked with mud and his face numb from cold. Anything to avoid the nursery, where those 2 small lives continued to scream. The wet nurse they had hired quit after 3 days, claiming the infants were impossible to soothe. Another came, lasted 2. Mrs. Whitfield tried to manage with the help of a young maid, but neither had the skill or the milk to properly care for premature twins. The nursery became a place of chaos, a constant reminder that Joseph was failing even at this, at keeping his own children alive and well. He stood outside the nursery door one night, listening to the wailing that seemed to pierce directly into his skull. Inside, he could hear Mrs. Whitfield's exhausted voice trying to sing a lullaby, but even that was drowned out by the infant's distress. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said when she emerged, her hair disheveled and dark circles under her eyes, "we must find someone who can devote themselves entirely to the children. A proper nurse, perhaps one who can still provide milk. They are not thriving, my lord." Joseph stared at her, his jaw tight. "And where do you propose we find such a woman?" The last two fled as if the house were cursed. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There is talk in the village. A young widow, recently bereaved, lost her own child, but can still nurse. The vicar mentioned her. She is desperate for work, for purpose. The thought of bringing another person into this house, into this grief, made Joseph's stomach turn. He did not want more strangers walking these halls, more eyes watching him, more voices offering sympathy he could not accept. But the crying continued behind the door, and he knew his housekeeper was right. Without help, his daughters might not survive. "Very well," he said finally, "send word, but I will interview her myself." Mrs. Whitfield nodded, relief clear on her face. "Yes, Your Grace. I will arrange it immediately." 2 days later, Joseph sat in his study, the fire crackling but providing no warmth. He had dressed carefully that morning, choosing the black morning coat that felt like armor, his cravat tied precisely despite his shaking hands. He told himself this was simply another task, another duty to be completed. Hire the nurse, ensure the children survive, move forward. But when Mrs. Whitfield knocked and opened the door, he was not prepared for what he saw. The woman who entered was thin, almost gaunt, her simple black dress hanging loose on her frame. But it was not her poverty that struck him. It was her eyes. Pale blue, red-rimmed, they held the same emptiness he saw in his own reflection each morning. This was not a woman seeking employment. This was someone trying to survive her own catastrophe. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said, "may I present Mrs. Rose Bennet?" Rose curtsied, her movements stiff and uncertain. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Joseph studied her in silence, noting the way she stood, the careful distance she maintained, the barely suppressed tremor in her shoulders. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She hesitated, then obeyed, perching on the edge as if ready to flee at any moment. He could see the pulse beating rapidly in her throat. "Mrs. Whitfield tells me you recently lost a child," he said, his voice deliberately flat. He would not offer sympathy. He had none left to give. Rose flinched as if he had struck her. "Yes, sir. A son. He was born too soon, too small. He lived only 3 days." The words were spoken so quietly he almost did not hear them, but the pain behind them was unmistakable. "And your husband?" "Died in an accident at the mill where he worked," she said, still not meeting his eyes. 6 months ago." Joseph felt a flicker of something, irritation perhaps at the unfairness of it all, but he pushed it aside. "Life is unfair," he thought bitterly. "I am learning that lesson well enough myself. I need someone who can care for my daughters," he said. "They are premature, difficult to soothe. 2 previous nurses have already given up. I will not tolerate another failure. Can you do what is required?" For the first time, Rose looked up, and their eyes met. Hers were no longer empty. Something burned there now, something fierce and desperate. "I do not need charity, my lord," she said, her voice stronger now. "I need a purpose. I heard your daughters need someone who will not abandon them. I will not abandon them." Joseph leaned back in his chair, surprised by the steel in her tone. She was not begging. She was making a promise. "You understand what you are agreeing to?" he asked. "Long nights, constant demands, 2 infants who seem determined to cry without end. I understand grief, sir," she said quietly, "and I understand what it means to need someone who will stay." Something in those words struck deep. Joseph looked away, staring at the fire. He should send her away. Hire someone older, more experienced, someone who would not carry their own sorrow into his home. But when he looked back at her, he saw only that same fierce determination. "Very well," he said. "You may go to the nursery. We will see if you are as capable as you claim." Rose followed Mrs. Whitfield up the stairs, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might burst. She had not expected the Duke to be so cold, so remote, but she had also seen the grief in his eyes, recognized it because it matched her own. 2 people drowning in separate oceans, she thought. Perhaps that is all we can ever be. The nursery door opened, and the sound hit her immediately. 2 infants crying in unison, their voices ragged with exhaustion. A young maid rocked one desperately while the other lay in a cradle, red-faced and flailing. Rose did not hesitate. She crossed the room and lifted the infant from the cradle, feeling the tiny body tense and arch in protest. She positioned the child carefully, supporting the small head, and began to hum. Not a proper song, just a low, rhythmic sound that her own mother had once used to soothe her. Slowly, she unlaced her bodice with one hand and brought the infant to her breast. The crying stopped almost immediately as the child latched on, the relief palpable in the sudden quiet. Rose closed her eyes, feeling the pull and tug, the strange mixture of pain and comfort. Her body remembered this even if her heart ached with the memory of the son who should have been in her arms instead. The other infant continued to fuss, but now Rose began to sing softly, a hymn she had learned as a girl. The words were simple, but the melody was gentle and steady. The second child quieted, listening, and within moments both infants were calm, one nursing, one simply resting in the maid's arms. From the doorway, unseen by anyone in the room, Joseph stood watching. He had followed them up, intending to observe for only a moment before returning to his study. But now he could not move. The nursery, which had been a place of chaos and despair for weeks, suddenly felt different, peaceful, almost like a home. He watched Rose rock gently, her face tilted down toward the infant, her voice soft and sure. She did not look like a duchess or a lady. She looked like what she was, a poor widow with nothing left but the ability to give. And yet, in that moment, she seemed to possess everything his household had been missing. Joseph turned and walked away before anyone could see him. But as he descended the stairs, he carried with him the memory of that scene, the first moment of peace Ravenshire had known since the night Eleanor died. Perhaps, he thought, Mrs. Whitfield was right. Perhaps this woman could save his daughters. He did not yet know that she might also save something in him he thought was already dead. The morning mist clung to Ravenshire like a shroud, thick and cold. Rose woke in the small chamber adjacent to the nursery, disoriented before memory returned. She was here. She had a place, a purpose, however fragile. The infants stirred in their cradles, tiny mewling sounds that would escalate quickly. Rose rose from the narrow bed, her body aching, and crossed the cold floor. She had nursed them 3 times during the night, her sleep fractured into brief intervals that left her hollow. When she lifted the first infant, feeling the warm weight against her chest, something eased inside her. This child needed her. Both did. For now, that was enough. Mrs. Whitfield entered carrying tea and bread. The older woman's face softened, seeing Rose already tending the babies. "You should have called for me," Mrs. Whitfield said. "You need rest too." Rose shook her head, settling into the rocking chair. "I am well enough. They are finding a rhythm now." Mrs. Whitfield poured tea, steam rising. "His Grace has not been to the nursery since you arrived. 3 days now." Rose felt a strange pang, though she could not say why. The Duke had made it clear this was a transaction. She was hired help. What did it matter if he came or stayed away? But she remembered the way he had looked at her in his study, that flash of recognition. 2 people drowning, she had thought. She still believed it. "He grieves in his own way," Rose said quietly. "Some men cannot bear to see what they have lost reflected in what remains." Mrs. Whitfield sighed. He was not always so cold. Before the Duchess died, he was different. Stern but not cruel, not distant like this. Rose said nothing. She had known men broken by loss. Her own father had never recovered from her mother's death, had withered until nothing remained but an empty shell. She recognized the signs in the Duke, that careful control keeping everything at a distance. The second infant began to fuss. Rose handed the first to Mrs. Whitfield, taking the other to nurse. They worked in comfortable silence, only the soft suckling and fire crackling. "What will you call them?" Rose asked. "They must have names." Mrs. Whitfield's expression troubled. "He has not chosen any. Says there will be time, but weeks have passed. The vicar keeps asking." Rose looked at the tiny face pressed against her. Delicate features, impossibly small fingers. Every child deserved a name, an identity. "Perhaps he needs help deciding," Rose said carefully. Sometimes grief makes even simple choices impossible. Mrs. Whitfield nodded. Perhaps. But I do not think he will listen to anyone now. He barely speaks to the steward, refuses visitors, spends days locked in his study or walking the grounds. Rose felt that pang again, sharper. She told herself it was only sympathy, but there was something more, something she would not examine closely. That evening, Rose ventured downstairs for the first time. The nursery was quiet, both infants sleeping deeply. Mrs. Whitfield had insisted she take a proper meal rather than surviving on bread and tea. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread. The cook, Mrs. Brennan, greeted Rose with surprising kindness, filling a plate with more food than she had seen in months. "Eat up, dear," Mrs. Brennan said. "You are too thin and those babies need you strong." Rose ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of curious glances from other servants. They were kind, but she sensed their wariness. She was an outsider, a widow with a tragic story, someone who might bring more sorrow to this already drowning house. She was finishing when raised voices echoed from above. The servants exchanged glances. "His Grace and the steward," Mrs. Brennan said quietly, arguing about estate accounts, nothing managed properly since the Duchess passed. Rose heard the Duke's voice now, sharp and cold, followed by placating tones. Then footsteps, heavy and quick, descending. The Duke appeared in the doorway, stopping when he saw the gathered servants. His hair was disheveled, his cravat loosened, eyes blazing with barely suppressed fury. But when his gaze fell on Rose, something shifted. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, voice still rough but quieter. "I trust the children are well?" Rose stood quickly. "Yes, Your Grace, both sleeping soundly." He nodded, seeming at a loss. The kitchen had gone silent, everyone watching. "Good," he said finally. "That is good." He turned to leave, then paused. "If you require anything, Mrs. Whitfield has been instructed to provide it. The children's welfare is paramount." "Thank you, sir," Rose said softly. "I have everything I need." Their eyes met, and Rose saw past the anger to exhaustion beneath. He looked like a man being pulled apart, stretched so thin he might shatter. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing. The kitchen slowly returned to life, whispers filling the space he left. Rose sat back down, hands trembling. She told herself it was only shock at seeing him so undone, but she knew it was more. She had felt something when their eyes met, a recognition beyond shared grief. She did not want to feel anything for the Duke of Ravenshire. She had come to heal, to find purpose in caring for his children. Any other feeling was dangerous, inappropriate, impossible. But climbing the stairs that night, she could not shake the image of his face, the way he had looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time. Days settled into rhythm. Rose devoted herself to the infants, learning their temperaments. One was calmer, content to be held. The other restless, demanding, crying at the slightest discomfort. Rose loved them both fiercely, as if they were her own. She saw little of the Duke, only glimpses as he passed through halls or rode out. But she felt his presence constantly, an awareness prickling along her spine. Late at night, when she rocked the infants, she would hear his footsteps pause outside the nursery door. He never entered, never spoke, but she knew he was there, listening to her sing. One afternoon, nearly a week after arriving, Rose was changing the infants' gowns when the Duke appeared in the doorway. She startled, nearly dropping the tiny dress. "Your Grace," she said, heart racing. "I did not hear you approach." He stepped in slowly, gaze fixed on the babies. Up close, she saw dark circles under his eyes, sharp lines of exhaustion carved into his face. "They seem content," he said quietly. "You have done well." Rose felt unexpected warmth at his words. "They are sweet children, sir, strong despite their early arrival." The Duke moved closer, looking down at the two infants side by side. Rose stepped back slightly, but could feel the tension radiating from him. "My wife wanted daughters," he said suddenly, voice rough. "She said sons inherit the world, but daughters must be taught to survive it. She would have been a good mother." Rose's throat tightened. "I am certain she would have been, Your Grace." He reached out, one finger touching the tiny hand of the nearest infant. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around his, and something cracked in his expression. For just a moment, Rose saw the man beneath the title, the father who had lost everything. "They need names," she said softly. "Every child deserves to be known by name." The Duke's jaw tightened, pulling his hand back. "I know. But every name I consider feels like betrayal. Eleanor and I discussed it, made lists. Now those lists are ash." Rose hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Perhaps that is the point, sir. Perhaps they need names that are theirs alone, not echoes of what was planned before." He looked at her sharply, and she feared she had overstepped. But his expression softened slightly. "What would you suggest, Mrs. Bennet?" Rose glanced at the infants. "One for the past, one for the future. A balance." "Helena," she said quietly. "For your Duchess," though spelled differently. A tribute without being identical. And hope, because that is what they represent now. The Duke was silent so long Rose thought he would reject the suggestion, but then he nodded slowly, eyes distant. "Helena and hope," he repeated. "Yes? That will do." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennet, for caring for them, for being here when no one else would stay." Before Rose could respond, he was gone, leaving her with the newly named infants and a strange ache in her chest that had nothing to do with grief. The weeks that followed brought a transformation to Ravenshire that no one had anticipated. The nursery, once a place of chaos and despair, became an oasis of calm under Rose's careful management. She established feeding schedules, created routines for sleep, and transformed the Stark room into something warmer with simple touches. Curtains pulled back to let in light, a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, soft blankets folded neatly in the cradles. Helena and Hope thrived under her care. Their tiny bodies grew stronger, their cries less desperate. Helena, the calmer of the two, would watch Rose with solemn dark eyes, while Hope demanded constant attention, her little fists waving as if trying to grasp the entire world. Rose found purpose in the rhythm of their days. Wake before dawn, nurse the babies, change them, sing to them, walk the nursery floor when they fussed. Mrs. Whitfield helped when she could, but Rose preferred to handle most tasks herself. These children had become her lifeline, the reason she rose each morning despite the weight of her own grief. Joseph kept his distance, or tried to. He told himself it was appropriate, necessary even. Rose was an employee, nothing more. But he found himself drawn to the upper floor more often than he cared to admit, always with some excuse, checking on repairs, speaking with Mrs. Whitfield, ensuring the household ran smoothly. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. He wanted to hear Rose's voice. Late one evening, unable to sleep, Joseph climbed the stairs to the nursery wing. He had no intention of entering, only wanted to confirm that all was well. The door stood slightly ajar, firelight flickering through the gap. He paused in the corridor, listening. Rose was singing, her voice low and sweet, a lullaby he did not recognize. The words were simple, something about stars and safe harbors, but the tenderness in her tone made his chest ache. Through the crack in the door he could see her seated in the rocking chair, Hope cradled against her chest. The firelight caught the auburn glints in Rose's dark hair, illuminated the gentle curve of her cheek as she looked down at the infant. She looked like a painting, something timeless and sacred. Joseph knew he should leave. This was an intrusion, a violation of her privacy, but his feet would not move. He stood frozen, watching as she adjusted the baby's gown with careful fingers, as she pressed a kiss to the tiny forehead, as she began to rock slowly, the chair creaking a soft rhythm. "Sleep now, little one," Rose murmured. "Tomorrow will come soon enough, with all its demands. But tonight you are safe, you are loved." Something twisted inside Joseph's chest, sharp and unexpected. When had someone last spoken with such unconditional tenderness in this house? When had anyone looked upon another with such pure, uncomplicated care? He turned away before she could sense his presence, descending the stairs with his heart beating too fast. In his study, he poured brandy with shaking hands and stared into the fire until dawn, trying to understand what he was feeling and failing completely. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Joseph was reviewing estate ledgers when Mrs. Whitfield knocked, her expression troubled. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "Mrs. Bennet's dress tore this morning. The fabric is worn through in several places. She has been mending it repeatedly, but it cannot be saved." Joseph looked up from his papers, "Then purchase new fabric and have it made up for her." Mrs. Whitfield hesitated. "Forgive me, sir, but I believe she would refuse. She is proud." "Perhaps if you presented it as part of her employment, a uniform of sorts." The suggestion irritated him, though he could not say why. Rose should not have to dress in rags while caring for his children, but he also understood pride, the fierce need to maintain dignity when everything else had been stripped away. "Do as you think best," he said curtly. "Ensure she has what is needed." Mrs. Whitfield nodded and withdrew. Joseph tried to return to his ledgers, but found his concentration shattered. He kept seeing Rose as she had appeared that first day, gaunt, pale, her dress hanging loose, her hands trembling. She had arrived with nothing and asked for nothing beyond the chance to be useful. That afternoon, he encountered her in the hallway outside the nursery. She was carrying Helena, swaying gently to soothe the fussing infant, and did not notice him at first. When she looked up and their eyes met, she stopped abruptly. "Your Grace," she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I was just taking her to see the garden from the window. The light is lovely this time of day." Joseph found himself moving closer, drawn by something he refused to name. "May I?" He held out his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Rose transferred the baby to him. Their hands brushed in the exchange, her fingers warm against his, and Joseph felt that touch like a shock through his entire body. Helena settled against his chest, her tiny head fitting perfectly in the hollow of his shoulder. Joseph inhaled sharply, overwhelmed by the reality of this small life, this daughter who carried Eleanor's features but would never know her mother. "She is growing stronger," Rose said softly, standing close enough that he could smell lavender and milk, and something uniquely her. "Her grip is quite fierce now." Joseph tested this, offering his finger, and Helena's impossibly small hand wrapped around it. The gesture was instinctive, trusting, and it broke something open inside him that he had been holding closed since Eleanor's death. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough, "for everything you have done. They would not have survived without you." Rose looked away, her throat working. "I only did what any woman would do, sir. They needed someone. I needed to be needed." The honesty in those words struck deep. Joseph glanced at her, seeing past the servant's demeanor to the woman beneath, strong, tender, carrying her own unbearable weight while shouldering his as well. Their eyes met again, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things that could not and should not be said. Joseph saw her lips part slightly, saw the pulse fluttering in her throat, and something in him yearned to close the distance to... Helena whimpered, breaking the spell. Rose stepped back quickly, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "I should return her to the nursery," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Hope will be waking soon." Joseph handed the baby back, careful this time to avoid touching Rose's skin. "Yes, of course." He watched her retreat down the corridor, his heart pounding as if he had run a great distance. This could not continue. These feelings, whatever they were, needed to be suppressed. Rose was his employee, a widow under his protection. Any attention beyond the strictly professional would be inappropriate, scandalous. But as he descended to his study, Joseph could not shake the memory of her face in the firelight, the sound of her voice singing to his daughters, the warmth of her fingers against his. Days passed, and the tension between them grew rather than diminished. They were scrupulously polite, carefully distant, but the awareness remained. Rose would feel his gaze on her as she walked the garden with the babies. Joseph would find himself listening for her footsteps, the sound of her voice, the particular way she laughed when Hope grabbed at her hair. One evening, Rose was embroidering tiny flowers onto a blanket when Joseph appeared in the nursery doorway. Both infants were asleep, the room peaceful and warm. "You have a talent for this," he said quietly, gesturing to her needlework. Rose looked up, surprised. "My mother taught me. She said even the simplest things deserve beauty. A wise woman. She was. Rose's fingers stilled on the fabric. I miss her still, though she has been gone 10 years. Joseph moved into the room, maintaining a careful distance. Does it ever ease? The missing. Rose considered this, her expression thoughtful. It changes. The sharp edges soften, but there are moments when it strikes fresh, as if no time has passed at all. Joseph nodded slowly. He understood that too well. Sometimes I turn to tell Eleanor something, then remember she is not there. It feels impossible that the world continues without her in it. Yet it does continue, Rose said gently, and we must decide whether to merely survive it or to truly live within it again. Their eyes met across the dim room, and Joseph felt that pull again, that dangerous attraction to her strength, her wisdom, her quiet beauty. She was right. The world continued. Life demanded participation, even from those who felt they had nothing left to give. I should let you rest, he said abruptly, stepping back toward the door. Tomorrow will come too soon. Yes, Your Grace. But he paused at the threshold, looking back. Joseph, he said quietly. When we are alone, you may call me Joseph. Rose's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. That would not be proper, sir. Perhaps not. But I find myself weary of propriety. He left before she could respond, but as he walked the dark corridors back to his chambers, Joseph carried with him the image of her shocked expression, the way color had flooded her cheeks, the knowledge that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Spring arrived at Ravenshire with tentative warmth, coaxing green shoots from the earth and filling the air with the scent of new growth. Rose had been at the estate for nearly 2 months, and the transformation was undeniable. Helena and Hope were thriving, their laughter now a common sound in the nursery. The household staff moved with lighter steps, and even Joseph seemed less burdened, though the shadows never fully left his eyes. Rose allowed herself to believe, for the first time since her husband's death, that perhaps she had found a place where she could heal. The work was demanding, but it gave her purpose. The children filled the hollow space in her arms. And Joseph? She would not let herself think too much about Joseph, about the way her heart raced when he appeared unexpectedly, about how his rare smiles seemed like gifts meant only for her, about the night he had asked her to call him by his given name, a request she had not dared to honor but could not forget. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when everything shattered. Rose was in the garden with Helena and Hope, both wrapped warmly against the cool breeze, when a carriage appeared on the drive. Not the elegant equipage of gentry, but something hired and rough. Her stomach tightened with inexplicable dread as 3 men descended. The first she recognized immediately, Mr. Sutton, tall, well-dressed in a way that could not quite hide his coarseness, with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. Behind him stood 2 larger men, their purpose clear in their bearing. Rose's blood turned to ice. She clutched Hope tighter, her other hand reaching for the pram where Helena lay. "Mrs. Bennet," Mr. Sutton called out cheerfully, as if they were old friends. "What a lovely surprise to find you in such pleasant circumstances." From a window in his study, Joseph looked up at the sound of voices. He saw Rose in the garden, her face drained of color, holding Hope protectively. 3 men approached her, and even from this distance he could read the threat in their posture. He was moving before conscious thought formed, striding through the house and out the side door with controlled fury building in his chest. "Mr. Sutton," Rose was saying, her voice trembling but steady, "this is not the place." "Oh, but I think it is precisely the place," Sutton interrupted smoothly. "You see, gentlemen, our dear Mrs. Bennet seems to have forgotten about the small matter of her late husband's debts, £30 to be exact, plus interest, of course." One of the larger men moved closer, and Rose instinctively stepped back, positioning herself between him and the children. "I have no money," she said. "You know this. I am working as a nurse here. Whatever my husband owed is now your responsibility," Sutton finished. "The law is quite clear on that point. Of course, there are other ways to settle accounts. I know several establishments in London that would welcome a woman of your looks. The work is not difficult, merely requires a certain flexibility of morals." The implications were clear and nauseating. Rose felt bile rise in her throat, even as rage flooded through her. "I would rather die." Sutton shrugged. "That can also be arranged, though it seems wasteful when you could be earning." Joseph's voice cut through the spring air like a blade. "That is quite enough." All heads turned. The Duke of Ravenshire approached with the controlled grace of a predator, his expression carved from ice. He had served as an officer in the Napoleonic Wars before inheriting his title, and every inch of that experience showed in his bearing now. "Your Grace," Sutton said, his smile widening, "I did not realize you were aware of our visit. We are simply here on a matter of business with your employee." "Then your business is with me," Joseph said coldly, positioning himself between Rose and the men. "State your claim plainly." Sutton's eyes gleamed. Mrs. Bennet's late husband accumulated debts before his untimely death, £30 initially, now grown to 45 with interest. As his widow, she inherited the obligation. "I am merely here to collect what is owed." Joseph glanced at Rose, saw her holding Hope so tightly the child began to fuss, saw the shame and terror warring in her expression. Something fierce and protective surged through him. "How long has this debt stood?" he asked, his tone dangerously quiet. 6 months, Your Grace. I have been patient, but patience has its limits. And you followed her here to collect from a nursemaid's wages?" Joseph's contempt was palpable. "How enterprising of you." Sutton's smile thinned. "I am a businessman, Your Grace, nothing personal." "Leave," Joseph commanded. "Remove yourself from my property immediately." The two larger men shifted, but Sutton held up a hand. "With respect, Your Grace, the debt remains. I will return, and next time I may bring the magistrate, or perhaps I will simply collect what I am owed in other ways. There are houses in London that would pay handsomely for—" "If you finish that sentence," Joseph interrupted, his voice dropping to something deadly, "I will personally ensure you never conduct business in England again. Do you understand me?" For the first time, Sutton looked uncertain. He studied Joseph's face and clearly saw something that gave him pause. Behind the Duke's civilized veneer was a man who had killed, who understood violence intimately, who would not hesitate to protect what he considered his. "We shall see, Your Grace," Sutton said finally, gesturing to his men. "But debts do not disappear simply because a duke finds them inconvenient." They retreated to their carriage, but Sutton's parting look at Rose was full of promise and threat. The message was clear. This was not over. As the carriage disappeared down the drive, Rose's legs gave way. She sank onto the garden bench, still clutching Hope, her entire body shaking. Joseph knelt beside her immediately, his hands hovering near her shoulders but not quite touching. "Rose," he said urgently, "are you hurt? Did they harm you?" She shook her head, unable to speak past the constriction in her throat. Helena began to cry in the pram, sensing the distress around her. "Mrs." Whitfield appeared from the house, taking both children with a knowing look that gave Rose and Joseph privacy. When they were alone, Rose finally found her voice. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you. I should have—" "Why did you not?" Joseph demanded, but his tone was more hurt than angry. "When you came here, why did you not mention this debt?" "Because I was ashamed," Rose said, tears finally spilling over. "Because my husband was a gambler and a drunk who spent every penny we had and more. Because he left me with nothing but debts and died before I could even hate him properly for it. Because I thought if I could just disappear into service, into usefulness, they would never find me." "How much?" Joseph asked quietly. Rose looked up at him through her tears. "What? How much do you owe?" £45 now, apparently. "But I have no way to pay it." "My wages here would take years to—" "I will handle it," Joseph interrupted. Rose stared at him. "You cannot. That is too much. I cannot accept—" "You can, and you will," he said firmly, finally letting his hands rest on her shoulders. "Because I will not allow those men to return here. I will not allow them to threaten you or speak to you in such vile terms. I will not allow anyone to take you from this place." The intensity in his voice, in his eyes, made Rose's breath catch. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Joseph opened his mouth, then closed it. "Because," he began, then stopped. "Because the children need you. because you have given everything to them, to this household, because you deserve to be safe." But Rose heard what he did not say, saw it written in every line of his face. "Because I cannot bear the thought of losing you. I will pay you back," she said desperately. "Every penny. I will work for years if I must." "We will discuss terms later," Joseph said, helping her to her feet. "For now, go inside. Rest. I have business to attend to in London." He left before she could protest further, striding toward the stables with purpose in every step. Rose watched him go, her heart a confusion of gratitude, shame, and something far more dangerous. She had known Joseph Carrington was a good man despite his grief. What she had not known was that he could be her savior, her protector, the answer to prayers she had been too afraid to speak aloud. And that realization terrified her more than Mr. Sutton ever could. Joseph did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, a glass of brandy untouched on the desk, staring at the ledger that contained his accounts. £45. It was nothing to a man of his wealth, a trivial sum that would not even register in his quarterly expenses. But the implications were anything but trivial. He kept seeing Rose's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she clutched hope, the shame and terror warring in her expression. He kept hearing Sutton's insinuations, the vile suggestion that Rose could work off her debt in London's brothels. The thought made his blood run cold, with a rage he had not felt since the battlefield. Joseph rose and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened grounds. Somewhere in this house, Rose was likely awake as well, tormented by fears he could barely imagine. The thought of her lying sleepless, believing herself a burden, believing she might be forced to leave or worse. It was intolerable. But why did it matter so much? Why did the thought of her absence create a hollow ache in his chest that rivaled even his grief for Eleanor? He knew the answer, had known it for weeks, but refused to acknowledge it. Rose had become essential to him, not merely as a nurse for his daughters, but as a presence that made the world bearable again. Her voice singing in the nursery, her rare smiles. The way she listened when he spoke, truly listened, as if his words mattered. The quiet strength she carried despite her own losses. He was falling in love with her, perhaps had already fallen. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it clarified everything. He would go to London. He would find Sutton. And he would ensure that the man never threatened Rose again, regardless of the cost. Dawn found Joseph dressed for travel, his valet securing the last of his bags. Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "Your Grace, is this truly necessary? Could you not simply send your man of business?" Joseph adjusted his coat. "No, this requires a personal touch." He found Rose in the nursery, dark circles under her eyes, confirming his suspicion that she had not slept. She was changing Helena's gown, her movements mechanical, her mind clearly elsewhere. "Mrs. Bennet," he said from the doorway. She startled, nearly dropping the tiny dress. "Your Grace, I did not hear you. I am departing for London," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Business matters that require my attention. I expect to return within 3 days." Rose's face grew even paler. "Please, you must not do this on my account. I will find another way to—" "There is no other way," Joseph interrupted gently. "And this is not a discussion. It is simply what will be done. But the cost is mine to bear," he said firmly. "You are under my protection now, Rose. That means something." The use of her given name hung in the air between them. Rose's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I do not know how to thank you," she whispered. "Then do not try," Joseph said. "Simply continue caring for my daughters. That is payment enough." He left before his resolve could weaken, before he could do something foolish like cross the room and take her in his arms. London greeted Joseph with its usual chaos, the noise, the crowds, the thick air heavy with coal smoke. He went directly to his townhouse, changed into evening clothes and set out to find information. Sutton was not difficult to locate. Men like him operated in the same circles, frequented the same establishments. By midnight, Joseph found himself in a gaming hell off St. James, the air thick with cigar smoke and desperation. Sutton sat at a card table, winning more than he should, his pile of coins suggesting cheating or extraordinary luck. Joseph watched from the shadows until the hand concluded, then approached. "Mr. Sutton," he said quietly. "A word, if you please." Sutton looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation. "Your Grace, I confess I did not expect to see you in such surroundings." "Life is full of surprises," Joseph replied. "There is a private room upstairs. We have business to discuss." Sutton gathered his winnings and followed, curious enough to comply. The room Joseph led him to was small, windowless, the kind of place where transactions of questionable legality occurred regularly. Joseph closed the door and placed a leather purse on the table between them. Inside was £60, more than Sutton was owed, significantly more. "Consider Mrs. Bennet's debt paid in full," Joseph said. "With interest and compensation for your trouble." Sutton picked up the purse, weighing it, his eyes gleaming. "That is generous, Your Grace, though I wonder why a duke concerns himself so deeply with a servant's debts." "That is none of your concern," Joseph said coldly. "What is your concern is this. You will never approach Mrs. Bennet again. You will strike her name from your books. You will forget she exists." Sutton smiled slowly. "And if I do not?" Joseph leaned forward, his voice dropping to something deadly soft. "I have connections in London and beyond. I know magistrates, lords, members of Parliament. I also know men of less respectable occupations, men who handle problems discreetly when asked by someone with sufficient resources." He let the implications hang in the air before continuing. "Your business operates in legal grey areas, Mr. Sutton. A few well-placed words could see you investigated for usury, fraud, perhaps even extortion. Your assets could be seized, your reputation destroyed. Or, if legal means prove too slow, there are other solutions. I spent years as an officer in His Majesty's army. I understand how men like you operate, and I know how to stop them." For the first time, Sutton's confidence wavered. "You are threatening me, Your Grace?" "I am making you a generous offer," Joseph corrected. £60 to walk away and never think of Rose Bennet again. Or we can explore the alternative, which I assure you will be far less pleasant for you." The silence stretched. Finally, Sutton pocketed the purse and stood. "You have made your point, Your Grace. The debt is satisfied. I have no further business with Mrs. Bennet." "See that you remember that," Joseph said. "Because if I hear you have approached her, spoken to her, or even thought too long in her direction, our next conversation will not be so civil." Sutton nodded once and left quickly, as if the room had grown too hot. Joseph remained, his hands shaking slightly now that it was done. He had just threatened a man, implied violence, used his position and wealth as weapons. The old Joseph, the one who existed before Eleanor's death, might have been shocked. But as he walked out into the London night, all Joseph felt was satisfaction. Rose was safe. That was all that mattered. He returned to Ravenshire 2 days later, travel-worn and exhausted. It was late afternoon when his carriage pulled up to the entrance. Mrs. Whitfield met him in the hall, relief clear on her face. "Welcome home, Your Grace. All has been well in your absence." "And Mrs. Bennet?" Joseph asked, trying to sound casual. "In the garden with the children, Mrs." Whitfield said, a knowing look in her eyes. "She has been anxious for your return." Joseph found them near the rose garden, still weeks from blooming, but showing green promise. Rose sat on a blanket, hope in her lap, while Helena attempted to crawl across the grass with determined concentration. Rose looked up as his shadow fell across them, her expression transforming from worry to relief to something more complex he could not name. "Your Grace," she said, starting to rise. "Please do not," Joseph said, settling onto the blanket beside her. "Propriety be damned. I have been sitting in carriages for 2 days. The grass is preferable." Hope reached for him immediately, and he took her, marveling as always at how much she had grown. Helena abandoned her crawling to demand attention as well, and soon he was surrounded by infants and chaos and something that felt dangerously close to happiness. "It is done," he said quietly, meeting Rose's eyes over Hope's head. The debt is paid. Sutton has agreed to never contact you again." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "How can I ever repay you?" "You cannot," Joseph said simply, "and I do not want you to try. Just stay. Care for my daughters. Be here." What he meant was be here for me. But he could not say that aloud. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But Rose heard it anyway. She reached across the blanket, her fingers brushing his, a touch that lasted only seconds but felt like a promise. "I will," she whispered. "For as long as you need me." Always, Joseph thought but did not say. "I will need you always. If this story has touched something in your heart, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. And tell me, what would you have done in Rose's place when Sutton appeared? Would you have asked for help or tried to handle it alone? Leave your thoughts below. The weeks following Joseph's return from London brought a subtle but unmistakable change to Ravenshire. The house that had been shrouded in mourning for so long began to breathe differently, as if the very walls sensed that life was returning to its corridors. Rose noticed it first in small things. The maids hummed as they worked. Mrs. Whitfield smiled more often. Even the grey stone of the estate seemed warmer somehow, catching the spring sunlight and holding it. But the most profound change was in Joseph himself. He no longer avoided the nursery. In fact, he visited daily, sometimes multiple times, always with some excuse, checking on repairs that did not need checking, bringing books he thought Rose might enjoy, asking questions about the children's progress that he clearly already knew the answers to. Rose understood what he was really doing. He was learning how to be a father to Helena and Hope. And perhaps, though neither of them dared speak it aloud, he was learning how to feel again. One morning, Rose was bathing the twins in the nursery when Joseph appeared in the doorway. Helena squealed with delight at the sight of him, splashing water everywhere. Hope, always more reserved, watched him with solemn, dark eyes. "They seem to enjoy their bath," Joseph observed, moving closer. "Helena does," Rose said with a laugh, wiping water from her face. "Hope merely tolerates it with great dignity." "She sounds like her father," Joseph said, then seemed surprised by his own words. "That is, I know what you meant," Rose said gently, lifting Helena from the basin and wrapping her in a warm towel. "And you are right. She has your temperament, I think. Serious, thoughtful. And Helena?" Rose smiled, drying the squirming infant. "Helena has your wife's joy. Mrs. Whitfield showed me a portrait. The resemblance is remarkable." Something passed across Joseph's face, but it was not the sharp pain Rose had grown accustomed to seeing when Eleanor was mentioned. Instead, it was softer, touched with something like peace. "Would you like to hold her?" Rose asked, offering the towel-wrapped bundle. Joseph took Helena carefully, and the infant immediately grabbed at his cravat, gurgling happily. He laughed, a sound Rose had rarely heard, and the warmth of it seemed to fill the entire room. "She has no respect for ducal dignity," he said. "Children never do," Rose replied, lifting Hope from the bath. "That is part of their charm." They worked together in comfortable silence, dressing the twins in fresh gowns, Rose guiding Joseph's clumsy fingers through buttons and ties. Their hands brushed repeatedly, each touch sending small shocks through Rose's system that she tried desperately to ignore. When both children were dressed and content, Joseph lingered rather than making his usual quick exit. "Rose," he said carefully, "there is something I have been wanting to discuss." Her heart jumped. "Yes, Your Grace?" "Joseph," he corrected, as he always did now when they were alone. "We discussed names before, Helena and Hope, but they should be baptized properly, with full names. I thought perhaps you might help me choose." Rose felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That is an honor I'm not certain I deserve, sir." "Joseph," he insisted again, "and you deserve it more than anyone. You have given them life in ways I could not. Please, help me do this right." Rose nodded slowly, settling into the rocking chair with Hope, while Joseph sat nearby with Helena. They spent the next hour discussing options, trading suggestions, occasionally laughing at particularly outlandish combinations. "Helena Eleanor," Joseph suggested at one point, "to honor her mother fully." Rose considered this, then shook her head gently. "Helena Grace, perhaps. Grace for the gift these children represent." the grace that allowed them to survive when they might not have. Joseph's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes," he said quietly, "that is perfect. And hope?" "Hope, Margaret," Rose said. "After my mother, if that would be acceptable." Joseph's expression softened. "More than acceptable. Hope Margaret Carrington. It suits her." The moment stretched between them weighted with significance. They were not just naming children. They were weaving their separate griefs and hopes into something shared, creating a future together, even as they pretended they were not. Helena fussed, breaking the spell, and Joseph rose to walk her around the room. Rose watched him, this man who had been so cold and distant when she arrived, now humming tunelessly to his daughter, his face transformed by tenderness. "You are a good father," she said softly. Joseph looked at her, surprised. "I am learning to be one. You make it possible." Before Rose could respond, before she could say something foolish about how he made many things possible for her as well, Mrs. Whitfield knocked and entered. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but the vicar has arrived. He wishes to discuss the christening." "Excellent timing," Joseph said. "Please show him to my study. I will be down shortly." After Mrs. Whitfield left, Joseph handed Helena to Rose, their fingers tangling briefly in the transfer. "Thank you," he said, "for helping me with this." "For everything." Rose watched him go, her heart full of emotions she could not name and dared not examine too closely. The christening was held 2 weeks later in the small chapel on the estate grounds. It was an intimate affair, attended only by household staff and a few neighbors who had known Eleanor. Rose stood beside the font, holding hope while Joseph held Helena, and together they made the promises that would guide these children into their faith. When the vicar spoke the names aloud, Helena Grace Carrington and Hope Margaret Carrington, Rose felt tears slip down her cheeks. Her mother's name, spoken in this sacred space, linked forever to this child she had come to love as her own. Joseph noticed her tears and shifted Helena so he could reach across and squeeze Rose's hand briefly. The gesture was small, quickly done, but it sent warmth flooding through her entire body. After the ceremony, they walked back to the house together, the twins now sleeping in their arms. The spring air was sweet with flowers, the sky impossibly blue, and for the first time since her own child had died, Rose felt something like happiness. "They should have a portrait made," Joseph said suddenly. "All 4 of us, to commemorate the christening." Rose stopped walking. "Your Grace, that would not be appropriate. I am merely nothing," Joseph interrupted firmly. "You are the woman who saved my daughter's lives, the woman who brought light back to this house. Your place in their history is secure, Rose. Let it be recorded." The way he said her name, with such warmth and conviction, made her dizzy. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They reached the house to find Mrs. Whitfield had prepared a small celebration, cakes and tea in the drawing room, with streamers that Helena would have loved. The staff gathered to offer congratulations, and for a brief moment, Ravenshire felt like a true home again. That evening, after the children were asleep, Rose stood at the nursery window, watching the sun set over the gardens. She heard Joseph's footsteps behind her but did not turn. "They are beautiful," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "The gardens, I mean. Eleanor planted most of them. She had excellent taste," Rose said. "She did," Joseph agreed. "But I think she would approve of what is growing here now. Not just flowers, but hope. Actual hope, not just the child's name." Rose finally turned to look at him. The fading light caught the angles of his face, softened the hard lines that grief had carved. He was handsome, she realized with a start, not in the conventional way, but in the way of men who had survived difficult things and emerged still capable of kindness. "Joseph," she said, using his name deliberately for the first time. "What are we doing?" He understood what she was really asking. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I know I do not want it to stop." His hand found hers in the shadows, their fingers intertwining. It was not quite a promise and not quite a beginning, but it was something neither of them could deny any longer. Below in the garden, the roses Eleanor had planted were beginning to bud, preparing to bloom in colors she would never see. But life, Rose thought, had a way of continuing despite loss. New flowers would grow. New love could take root in soil that had known grief, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was not a betrayal, but a blessing. Summer arrived at Ravenshire with languid warmth, transforming the estate into something almost dreamlike. The gardens exploded with colour. The twins grew stronger and more curious with each passing day, and the connection between Joseph and Rose deepened into something neither could pretend to ignore any longer. They had fallen into patterns of intimacy that would have scandalized anyone who noticed. Joseph now took breakfast in the nursery rather than the formal dining room. Rose joined him for evening walks through the gardens after the children slept. They spoke of everything and nothing: books, childhood memories, dreams they had once held, and those they were only beginning to imagine again. But the outside world was not blind to these changes. It began with whispers in the village. The butcher's wife mentioned to the baker that the Duke seemed remarkably attached to his children's nurse. The baker told the seamstress, who told Lady Augusta Pemberton during a fitting. And Lady Augusta, a woman who considered herself the moral compass of the county, decided something must be done. On a Tuesday afternoon, when the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain, 3 carriages arrived at Ravenshire unannounced. From them emerged Reverend Whitmore, Lady Augusta, and Mrs. Beaumont, a widow of substantial wealth and even more substantial opinions. Joseph was in his study when Mrs. Whitfield announced them, her face tight with worry. "Your Grace, they insist on speaking with you immediately. They say it is a matter of grave importance." Joseph set down his pen with deliberate calm, though his jaw tightened. "Show them in." The 3 entered with an air of righteous purpose that immediately set Joseph's teeth on edge. Lady Augusta, tall and angular, took the lead. "Your Grace," she began without preamble, "we come as friends concerned for your welfare and that of your daughters." "Indeed," Mrs. Beaumont added, settling herself without being asked, "we have heard most distressing reports." Joseph leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. What reports would those be? Reverend Whitmore cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Your Grace, it has come to our attention that Mrs. Bennet, your children's nurse, resides in your home without proper chaperonage or oversight. A young widow living under your roof, caring for your children in such intimate circumstances." "She is their nurse," Joseph interrupted coldly. "Where else would she reside?" Lady Augusta's lips thinned. "Do not be deliberately obtuse, Your Grace. The appearance of impropriety is as damaging as impropriety itself. You are a widower. She is a young woman of no family and questionable background. The 2 of you are seen walking together, dining together, spending hours in each other's company. I fail to see how discussing my children's welfare constitutes scandal," Joseph said, his voice dangerously quiet. Mrs. Beaumont leaned forward. "Your Grace, we understand grief can cloud judgment, but you must consider your daughters' futures. What family of quality will accept them if their father's household is the subject of such gossip? What marriages can they hope to make if society questions the morality of their upbringing?" The words hit like calculated blows, each one designed to wound where Joseph was most vulnerable, his daughter's welfare. Furthermore, Reverend Whitmore added nervously, there are legal considerations. Should questions arise about the propriety of your household, the courts might take an interest in the guardianship of the children. You are not their mother's blood relative. Your claim, while legal, could be challenged if your moral character is called into question. Joseph felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "And what precisely do you suggest I do?" Lady Augusta smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "Mrs. Bennet must leave, of course. We can help her find suitable employment elsewhere, or if you feel you must keep her in your service for the children's sake, then you must marry her. Make the situation legitimate in the eyes of God and society." The room fell silent. Joseph stared at them, processing what had just been said. They were giving him an ultimatum: send Rose away or marry her. "I will consider your words," he said finally, standing to indicate the meeting was over. "Thank you for your concern." But Lady Augusta was not finished. "You have 1 week, Your Grace. If Mrs. Bennet is still in residence without benefit of marriage by then, We will have no choice but to bring these concerns before the proper authorities. For the children's sake, you understand." They departed in a rustle of silk and self-righteousness, leaving Joseph standing in his study, hands clenched into fists. Rose had heard parts of the conversation from the hallway where she had been passing with Hope. She had not meant to eavesdrop, but their raised voices had carried. Now she stood frozen, her heart pounding with shame and terror. She was ruining everything. Her presence here, which had seemed like salvation, was now a threat to Joseph's daughters, to his reputation, to everything he held dear. That night, after putting the twins to bed, Rose made her decision. She packed her small bag with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as she folded her few possessions. She would leave tonight, before Joseph could sacrifice himself or his children's futures for her sake. She was descending the stairs, bag in hand, when Joseph appeared at the bottom. He took in the scene instantly, the bag, her tear-stained face, her expression of desperate determination. "No," he said simply, blocking her path. "I must," Rose whispered. "You heard them. I am destroying your life, your daughter's futures. I cannot let that happen." "So you would just leave?" Joseph demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "Disappear into the night without a word. Leave Helena and Hope to wonder where you went. Leave me." He stopped, the unspoken words hanging between them. "Leave you what?" Rose asked, her voice breaking. "I am nothing to you, Joseph. A servant, an employee. I have no right to stay when my presence causes such harm." Joseph moved closer, his eyes blazing. "You think you are nothing to me. You think these past months have meant nothing. They cannot mean anything," Rose said desperately. "You are a duke. I am a penniless widow with nothing to offer. Those people were right. I should never have stayed so long. I should never have let myself—" "Let yourself what?" Joseph pressed, now standing so close she could feel the heat of him. "Feel something for me. Because I have felt something for you, Rose. I have tried not to. I have told myself it was wrong, that it betrayed Eleanor's memory, that the difference in our stations made it impossible. But none of that changes the truth." "What truth?" Rose whispered, afraid to hope. "That I love you," Joseph said, the words tumbling out as if he could not hold them back any longer. "That I need you not just as a nurse for my children, but as the woman who makes me want to live again. That the thought of you leaving tears something inside me that I fear will never heal." Rose's bag slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. "Joseph," she breathed, "we cannot. Society will never—" "Society can burn for all I care," he said fiercely. "But if you leave, if you walk out that door, then they win. They take from me the one thing that has brought me back to life." His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Tell me you feel nothing for me," he said softly. "Tell me these months have been merely employment to you. Tell me that and I will let you go." Rose looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his strength, the hope beneath his fear. "I cannot tell you that," she whispered, "because it would be a lie." "Then stay," Joseph said. "Marry me. Not because society demands it, but because I want you as my wife. Because I want to wake every morning knowing you are here. Because I want to give Helena and Hope a mother who loves them as fiercely as you already do." "I was hired to be a nurse," Rose said, her voice trembling, "not a duchess." "You were hired to save my daughters' lives," Joseph corrected, "but you saved mine as well. Stay, Rose, please. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." In the dim hallway, with his hands cradling her face and his heart laid bare before her, Rose finally let herself believe that perhaps she deserved this. Deserved love, deserved happiness, deserved a second chance at the life she thought she had lost. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will stay. I will marry you." Joseph's kiss was gentle at first, reverent, as if she were something precious that might break. But Rose rose on her toes, her hands sliding up his chest to his shoulders, and the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more desperate, more real. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, and for the first time since that terrible night when Eleanor died, Joseph felt whole. The kiss in the hallway had broken something open between them, releasing feelings that had been restrained for far too long. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Joseph took Rose's hand and led her not toward the stairs, but toward the library, where a fire still burned low in the hearth. He closed the door behind them, not to hide, but to give them the privacy this moment deserved. The room was cast in shadows and amber light, intimate and safe. "Rose," Joseph said, his voice rough, "if this is too soon, if you need time—" She silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. "I have spent months denying what I felt for you," she whispered. "I do not want to deny it any longer." Joseph caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers through her entire body. His other hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with such tenderness it made her throat tighten. "You are certain?" he asked. "Because once we cross this threshold, there is no returning. You will be mine, Rose, and I will be yours." The intensity in his eyes, the barely restrained hunger mixed with reverence, made her knees weak. "I am certain," she breathed. "I want to be yours, Joseph. Completely." The last word seemed to undo something in him. He pulled her close, one hand sliding into her hair, while the other wrapped around her waist, and kissed her with a passion that left no room for doubt. This was not the tentative kiss of the hallway. This was claiming, promising, a declaration made with lips and breath, and the press of bodies finally allowed to acknowledge their need. Rose's hands moved up his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms, the solid warmth of him. She had forgotten what it felt like to be touched with desire, to be wanted not just for what she could provide, but for who she was. Joseph's kisses moved from her mouth to her jaw, to the sensitive spot below her ear that made her gasp. "Tell me what you want," he murmured against her skin. "Tell me, Rose." "You," she whispered, her fingers working at the buttons of his waistcoat. "Just you. All of you." They moved together toward the settee near the fire, shedding clothes with fumbling fingers and breathless laughter when buttons proved stubborn. Joseph's coat fell first, then his waistcoat. Rose's fingers trembled as she loosened his cravat, revealing the strong column of his throat. His hands found the fastenings of her dress, and she felt the whisper of fabric sliding from her shoulders. The cool air made her shiver, but Joseph's hands, warm and sure, traced paths along her skin that left fire in their wake. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "So beautiful it hurts to look at you." Rose blushed, suddenly shy despite her desire. "I am too thin," she protested. "The past year has been—" "Perfect," Joseph interrupted, his fingers tracing the curve of her collarbone, the line of her shoulder. "You are perfect, Rose. Every part of you." He guided her down onto the settee, the cushions soft beneath her back. His body covered hers, and the weight of him, the heat, felt like coming home. Their kisses grew more urgent, more desperate, hands exploring newly revealed skin with increasing boldness. Joseph's mouth moved lower, trailing kisses down her throat, across her collarbone, his breath hot against her skin. Rose arched into his touch, her fingers tangling in his hair, holding him close as pleasure built in waves through her body. "Joseph," she breathed. "Please." He lifted his head to look at her, his eyes dark with desire, but also with something deeper. Love, pure and uncomplicated. "I need you to know," he said, his voice rough. "This is not just physical for me. When I take you as mine, it is forever. Body and soul, Rose. Forever." Tears pricked her eyes at the intensity of his words. "Forever," she agreed. "I am yours, Joseph, now and always." What followed was a slow revelation of intimacy, a dance of give and take as they learned each other's bodies, each other's pleasures. Joseph was gentle but insistent, his touches both reverent and demanding. Rose met his passion with her own, no longer the hesitant widow, but a woman claiming her right to desire, to be desired. The fire crackled beside them as their bodies moved together, finding rhythm, finding connection. Rose felt the last walls around her heart crumble as Joseph whispered her name like a prayer. As his hands and mouth learned every curve and hollow of her body, as pleasure built between them in waves that grew stronger and stronger. "I love you," Joseph murmured against her skin, his voice breaking with emotion. "God help me, I love you so much." "I love you too," Rose gasped, her body arching against his. "Joseph, I—" The words dissolved into breathless sounds as pleasure crested and broke over them both. Joseph buried his face in her neck, his body shuddering, and Rose held him close, her own release washing through her in waves that seemed endless. In the aftermath, they lay tangled together on the settee, hearts gradually slowing, breathing evening out. Joseph pulled a blanket from the back of the furniture and wrapped it around them both, gathering Rose against his chest. She nestled into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, the rise and fall of his breathing. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and she had never felt safer, more cherished, more perfectly where she belonged. "I should be scandalized by my own behavior," Rose said softly, a smile in her voice. "A proper lady would be." Joseph pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then, I am grateful you are not a proper lady. You are something far better. You are mine." "And you are mine," Rose replied, tilting her head up to look at him. "No matter what society says, no matter what obstacles come, I will not let you go, Joseph Carrington." "Good," he said, capturing her lips in a tender kiss. "Because I have no intention of being let go." They stayed that way for a long time, wrapped in firelight and each other, speaking in whispers about the future they would build together, about how they would marry quickly, quietly, before anyone could object, about how they would raise Helena and Hope together as true parents, about the life they would create from the ashes of their grief. When the fire finally burned low and the night grew cold, Joseph carried Rose upstairs, not to her small chamber near the nursery, but to his own rooms, to the bed he had shared with Eleanor, but which would now become theirs. As they slipped beneath the covers, bodies intertwining once more, Rose felt the last shadow of guilt lift from her shoulders. This was not betrayal. This was healing. This was love in all its messy, complicated, beautiful reality. Joseph made love to her again in the darkness, slower this time, sweeter, each touch a promise written on skin. And when they finally slept, wrapped in each other's arms, both dreamed of sunlight and children's laughter and a future that, against all odds, they had found together. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over Ravenshire, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day, a new beginning, and two hearts, once broken, now beating as one. Morning light filtered through the curtains of Joseph's chambers, casting golden patterns across the bed, where Rose lay nestled against his chest. She woke slowly, awareness returning in pieces. The warmth of his body beside hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the unfamiliar luxury of silk sheets against her skin. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. What had they done? But then Joseph's arm tightened around her waist, and he pressed a kiss to her shoulder, and the panic dissolved into certainty. This was right. This was exactly where she belonged. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "Do you regret it?" Rose turned in his arms to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes despite his confident tone. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Do you?" Joseph's answer was a kiss that left no room for doubt. When they finally broke apart, both smiling, the morning felt full of promise rather than complications. But complications arrived nonetheless. Mrs. Whitfield's discreet knock came an hour later, after Rose had returned to her own chamber to make herself presentable. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said when Joseph admitted her, "Reverend Whitmore and Lady Augusta have returned. They are waiting in the drawing room and insist on speaking with you immediately." Joseph's jaw tightened. "Of course they have. Very well. Please ask Mrs. Bennet to join us." "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said carefully, "is that wise? Given the nature of yesterday's conversation—" "It is necessary," Joseph interrupted. "Trust me, Mrs. Whitfield." When they gathered in the drawing room, the atmosphere was tense. Lady Augusta sat ramrod straight, her expression one of righteous anticipation. Reverend Whitmore looked uncomfortable but determined. Mrs. Beaumont had returned as well, her sharp eyes missing nothing as Rose entered, and took a seat beside Joseph rather than standing submissively by the door. "Your Grace," Lady Augusta began, "we have come for your answer. Has Mrs. Bennet been dismissed from your service?" "No," Joseph said calmly, "she has not." Lady Augusta's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Then you leave us no choice but to—" "I am not finished," Joseph interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of generations of nobility. "Mrs. Bennet has not been dismissed because she is no longer in my employ. As of this morning, she has accepted my proposal of marriage." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Augusta's mouth opened and closed without sound. Mrs. Beaumont looked genuinely shocked. Only Reverend Whitmore seemed unsurprised and perhaps even relieved. "That is," Rose began nervously, "if the Reverend would be willing to perform the ceremony today." "Today?" Lady Augusta finally found her voice. "Impossible. The banns must be read, arrangements made, proper notices given." Or Joseph said smoothly, "A special license can be obtained, which I secured yesterday while in London." He produced the document from his pocket. "I anticipated that marriage might become necessary, though I confess my reasons have evolved considerably since then." He looked at Rose as he said this, and the warmth in his gaze made her blush. What had begun as a practical solution to society's demands had become something infinitely more precious. "Your Grace," Reverend Whitmore said carefully, "if you are certain this is what you wish, I would be honored to perform the ceremony today, if that is your desire." "It is," Joseph confirmed. "In the estate chapel this afternoon. You are all, of course, invited to attend, as witnesses to the legitimacy of the union you were so concerned about." Lady Augusta looked as if she had bitten into something sour. "This is highly irregular, but legal," Joseph said, "and moral, and most importantly, what we both want, unless you have objections that go beyond propriety." Lady Augusta had no answer for that. She had demanded marriage to protect the children and preserve appearances. She could hardly object now that she was getting exactly what she had insisted upon. "Very well," she said stiffly, "we shall attend. To ensure everything is done correctly." After they left, Rose turned to Joseph with wide eyes. "You had a special license since yesterday?" Joseph had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I thought it might prove useful. But Rose, if you truly need more time, we can wait. We do not have to do this today simply because society demands it." Rose took his hand, squeezing gently. "We are doing this today because I love you, because I want to be your wife, because I want to wake beside you every morning without shame or secrecy. Society's demands have nothing to do with it anymore." Joseph pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "How did I become so fortunate?" "I ask myself the same question," Rose whispered, "every single day." The wedding took place at 4 o'clock that afternoon in the small stone chapel on the Ravenshire grounds. Mrs. Whitfield had worked miracles in the few hours available, gathering wildflowers for the altar, pressing Rose's best dress, ensuring everything was as proper as time allowed. Rose wore a simple gown of pale blue, not white as she was a widow remarrying, but Mrs. Whitfield had woven white roses into her hair, and she carried a small bouquet of the same. She looked beautiful, nervous, and radiantly happy. Joseph waited at the altar in his finest black coat, the one Eleanor had chosen for formal occasions. He had considered changing it, but Mrs. Whitfield had gently suggested that Eleanor would have wanted him to wear it, to carry her blessing into this new chapter. When Rose entered the chapel on Mrs. Whitfield's arm, having no father or family to give her away, Joseph's breath caught. She was not just beautiful, she was his future, walking toward him with trust and love shining in her eyes. The ceremony was simple but profound. Reverend Whitmore spoke of second chances, of God's grace in bringing light from darkness, of the holy union between two souls who had known loss and chosen love anyway. "Joseph Carrington, Duke of Ravenshire," the Reverend intoned, "do you take Rose Margaret Bennet to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" "I do," Joseph said, his voice strong and sure, his eyes never leaving Rose's face. "Rose Margaret Bennet, do you take Joseph Carrington, Duke of Ravenshire, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, Till death do you part." "I do," Rose whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Your Grace, you may kiss your bride." Joseph stepped forward, cupping Rose's face in his hands with infinite tenderness. This kiss was different from those they had shared in passion the night before. This was a promise made before God and witnesses, a public claiming, a beginning. When they turned to face the small assembly, Rose was now the Duchess of Ravenshire. Lady Augusta looked as if she had swallowed vinegar. Mrs. Beaumont seemed torn between disapproval and reluctant approval. But Mrs. Whitfield was beaming, and several maids dabbed at their eyes. The most important witnesses, however, were not in the chapel. Upstairs in the nursery, Helena and Hope slept peacefully, unaware that they now had a mother again. But they would know. Rose would make certain they knew they were loved, wanted, cherished. The wedding breakfast was modest but joyful. The staff had prepared their finest dishes, and toasts were offered, some sincere, others perfunctory. But Joseph and Rose barely noticed. They only had eyes for each other, hands clasped beneath the table, already counting the moments until they could be alone again. As evening fell and the guests finally departed, Joseph led Rose up the grand staircase, but first they stopped at the nursery. Together they stood over the sleeping twins, watching the gentle rise and fall of tiny chests. "They have a mother now," Joseph said softly. "A real mother." "They always did," Rose replied, her hand finding his, "from the moment I held them. But now it is official." They kissed there in the doorway, silhouetted by candlelight, two people who had been broken finding wholeness in each other. Below them, Ravenshire settled into night, but it was no longer a house of mourning. It was a home filled with love, with possibility, with the kind of future neither of them had dared to hope for. And in the master chambers, as Joseph carried his bride across the threshold and into their new life together, both of them understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The best kind of beginning, one built on honesty, sacrifice, and the courage to love again despite everything that had been lost. Spring turned to summer, and summer began its slow fade toward autumn. Ravenshire transformed under Rose's gentle influence, becoming not just a grand estate, but a true home. The corridors that had once echoed with grief now rang with children's laughter. The gardens flourished under her care, and the staff moved with lighter steps, no longer walking on eggshells around a duke consumed by sorrow. Joseph had changed as well. The hard lines of grief that had carved themselves into his face softened. He smiled more, laughed readily, and most remarkably, he allowed himself to be happy without guilt. Eleanor's portrait still hung in the main hall, and fresh flowers were placed beneath it each week. But it was no longer a shrine to the past, simply a respectful acknowledgement of what had been. Rose had worried, in those early weeks of marriage, that she would always be compared to the Duchess who had come before. But Joseph made certain she understood that his love for her was not diminished by the love he had held for Eleanor. The heart, he told her one night as they lay tangled together, has an infinite capacity for love. One does not replace the other. They simply exist together, each precious in its own way. Helena and Hope were thriving. At 10 months old, they were crawling everywhere, pulling themselves up on furniture and babbling in a language only they seemed to understand. Helena had Joseph's serious temperament, but Rose's ready smile. Hope was bold and adventurous, always the first to explore something new. And they called Rose Mama. That simple word, spoken in tiny voices, never failed to bring tears to her eyes. On a golden afternoon in early autumn, Rose knelt in the garden, her hands deep in rich soil, planting sunflowers along the stone pathway that led to the chapel where she and Joseph had married. She wore a simple dress, her hair loosely braided, completely unbothered by the dirt beneath her fingernails or the smudge of earth on her cheek. Joseph found her there, the twins playing on a blanket nearby under Mrs. Whitfield's watchful eye. He stood for a moment, simply observing, his wife, his daughters, the peace that had finally settled over his life like a benediction. "Sunflowers?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Any particular reason?" Rose sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand and likely adding more dirt. "Because they are resilient," she said. They survive storms, turn toward the light no matter what darkness surrounds them. They reminded me of us, of how we found each other in the middle of our grief and chose to turn toward hope instead of remaining in shadow. Joseph felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You have a poet's soul, Mrs. Carrington." Rose smiled at the name she still sometimes forgot was hers. "Duchess," she corrected playfully. "You married me, Your Grace. Now you are stuck with my poetry and my gardening and my terrible singing." "Your singing is not terrible," Joseph protested. "The girls love it." "The girls are not discerning critics," Rose laughed, "but I am grateful for their loyalty." Movement caught their attention. Helena had pulled herself up using the edge of the blanket and was taking tentative, wobbling steps toward them. It was not her first time walking, but each instant still felt miraculous. Joseph and Rose both froze, watching as their daughter navigated the grass with determined concentration. "Mama," Helena said clearly, reaching Rose and falling into her arms. "Papa." Joseph gathered them both close, and Hope, not wanting to be left out, crawled over to join the embrace. For a moment, they were a tangle of arms and laughter, and pure, uncomplicated joy. Later, after the children had been fed and bathed and sung to sleep, Joseph and Rose walked the garden together, as was their custom. The sunflowers she had planted would not bloom until next spring, but Rose described them so vividly, tall golden faces tracking the sun, seeds that would feed birds through winter, beauty emerging from patient waiting. "Do you ever regret it?" Joseph asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean." "Taking on not just a husband, but 2 children and an entire estate and a title you never asked for." Rose stopped walking, turning to face him in the twilight. "Every single day," she said solemnly. His face fell for just a moment before she smiled. "Every day I regret that I did not meet you sooner, that we did not have more time, that Helena and Hope will not remember the woman who gave them life, though we will make certain they know her story." She reached up to cup his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "But do I regret loving you, marrying you, becoming mother to your children?" "Not for 1 second, Joseph, not even for a heartbeat." Joseph pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, lavender and sunshine and earth. "I did not think I would ever feel whole again," he said quietly. "After Eleanor died, after I held those screaming infants and felt nothing but despair, I thought that was my future. Duty without joy. Existence without life. And now," Rose prompted, though she knew the answer. "Now I understand that healing is not betrayal," Joseph said, "that loving you does not diminish what I felt for Eleanor, that it is possible to honor the past while embracing the future. You taught me that, Rose, you and our daughters, Rose repeated, savoring the words. "Yes, ours." They kissed there in the garden, surrounded by the ghosts of what had been and the promise of what was yet to come. Above them, stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Inside the house, their children slept safely, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, the future felt not like something to be endured, but something to be celebrated. As they walked back toward the house, Rose paused to look up at the nursery windows, where soft candlelight glowed. "When I first came here," she said softly, "I was so broken, I did not think I would ever feel human again. I thought I would spend the rest of my life going through motions, caring for other people's children because I had lost my own. I never imagined I could have this, love, family, home. But you do have it," Joseph said firmly. "You have us, and we have you. That is the miracle, Rose. Not that we survived our grief, but that we found each other within it." They entered the house together, hand in hand, and the door closed behind them on a home that had been rebuilt from sorrow into something beautiful. The next morning, Helena and Hope would wake demanding breakfast and attention. The estate would require management. Society would continue with its judgments and expectations. But none of that mattered as much as this. 2 people who had been hired to fulfill one role and discovered they were meant for so much more. Rose had been hired only to be a nanny, but she had become a mother, a wife, a duchess, and most importantly, the woman who taught a grieving duke that his heart could beat again. That love lost did not mean love was impossible, that from the deepest darkness, if one had the courage to reach toward it, light could still emerge. And in the garden, the sunflower seeds waited patiently in the earth, ready to push toward the sun when spring returned. Just as Rose had, just as Joseph had, just as anyone who has known grief and chosen, despite everything, to love again. Sometimes the greatest love stories are about two broken souls finding shelter in each other's arms. Rose and Joseph discovered that healing is not linear, that honoring the past does not mean abandoning the future, and that the person hired to care for your children might end up healing your wounded heart. Their journey reminds us it is never too late for a second chance, that love can bloom even in the coldest winter, and that the most profound transformations begin with the smallest acts of courage. If this story touched your heart, I would be honored if you would leave a like. It helps others discover these tales of hope. Please subscribe for more stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. And tell me, where in the world are you listening? Share your location in the comments. Thank you for allowing me to share Rose and Joseph's journey with you. Until next time, may you always turn toward the light.